Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute privilege and pleasure to have today Dr. Richard C. Miller. I've asked Dr. Miller to come on and talk about, because it's Easter, and I hadn't really planned anything for Easter, but I thought, hey, we should be talking about resurrection. And I got Dr. Miller's book last week. It's right here, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. Apologies that the title is backward on my camera, but I've devoured this book in the last few days. I'm 3/4 of the way through it. I had to be really honest before we got started and said that I've read a lot of it, but not quite all of it. And the reason for that is because, hey, it's Good Friday as we're recording this. We have to strike while the iron's hot. And if you ever have watched any media outlets, you'll know that Easter is the time when you have to come up with something relevant. And usually if that's a media outlet, they're coming up with like a new lost tomb of Jesus we didn't know about or something. But today we're going to talk about resurrection in both the Gospels and some other relevant sources. So let me say, Dr. Richard C. Miller, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. This is great to be on your show. I've been a fan for quite a while, and I saw you go on to Myth Vision with Eric, and reached out to you, and we just have a lot of common ground and interesting kind of angles to discuss today, I think. So I'm
We
excited to
had,
be.
yeah, we had covered a lot of the same. It's interesting once we started talking how much of the same we kind of, I think, overlapped a little bit, and a lot of the people we know and the circles we ran in without ever actually encountering one another before this.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So what I'd like to do today, just to kind of whet the appetite of the viewers, there's so much stuff here. So essentially, what Dr. Miller has done is just done a really incredible dive all of the into a lot of ancient stories about resurrection, about translation. We'll talk about some of the different ideas and some of the different kind of definitions as we go, I think. But this book is so fantastic, and everybody should get it. I'll leave a link to it below. But there's way too much to cover in one conversation. To start with, I thought, in honor of Easter, maybe what we could do is just take a couple texts and take a really close look at these texts, both Christian and otherwise. I have the expert in the house, so I'm really pleased to be able to do this with you. And if the audience will follow along with us, we'll look at these texts. One of them is very close to, well, all of the texts in Dr. Miller's book are very close to the gospel accounts in different ways, but I've picked one that I think showcases really nicely some of the crossovers. So we'll walk through the text. We'll maybe get you to do some commentary on it. I think hopefully that'll get us started, and then we can pick up at a later date with some other stuff. That sounds okay?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. A lot of people just have the idea, and it's not even just a layperson thing. Even in the academy, a lot of people looking at studying early Christianity or Second Temple Judaism will say, this is really unique, and there are not really a lot of comparables to the Gospels, for example, and to make that argument, they'll look often at Judean or Jewish literature, many of which, something like Qumran, for example. And I think the first question is, do we have anything to kind of compare to the Gospels? Like, how have people approached this question in the past of like, is Christianity really unique in its context? How have people approached that question? And what has maybe been missed that we can kind of use to tee up our conversation for today?
Well, I think there's a couple of areas that have biased the discussion coming into this. From most of the people that are studying this are studying it from a religious background or just an interest where they're kind of taught in that framework often. And so there's two things there that go on. One is that this was the inbreaking of God, and therefore, the Karl Barth kind of idea that God intruded into history, and therefore the creative elements, the communication, whatever, was divine, and therefore should not have a whole lot of antecedents in terms of mythology, because there's no mythology in that, right? And so even talking about Christian mythology, you just don't hear people say that phrase as a thing, And even in religious studies departments and seminaries and divinity schools and stuff, you won't hear that phrase often, early Christian mythology. And so that's a problem, because it sort of just, it takes people and says, okay, well, we're not going to look then at the larger context for all of the antecedents that you would expect with any other developing kind of system of thought or mythology in the histories of civilizations anywhere. And so automatically you're kind of shutting down that project that would normally just be par for the course in any other study. There's that.
Yeah.
There's the
Well,
second
I
one.
was going to ask, no, that's a great, yeah, that's a great start. And then to follow up, I think one of the things, like a lot of my research has focused on diasporas and antiquity as well, both Judean and otherwise. I think there's also maybe a problem with the way we imagine that people, and let's just, we have to keep this narrow. And often what happens is we end up looking at the Mediterranean diaspora. There's, diasporas in other places in the ancient world. But if we're looking at a Greek city in the Mediterranean, which is, we know where Christianity spread. We know Paul went and preached to a lot of well-known Greek cities. We know a lot of the earliest church fathers were in great cities like Alexandria and Antioch. I think a lot of people maybe think about Jewish life in a city like that as being something like, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm almost thinking like Fiddler on the Roof or something, like a very unique bounded community with, its unique set of kind of ways of being and traditions and really, really clear cut boundaries as to where everybody else is and where we are. And we think about a religion fundamentally. And in our field, there's been a big push against talking about the word religion in antiquity, and people might push back against that. But there's a really good reason that a lot of the times what we're thinking of when we're thinking of religion and antiquity, I think may just not fit. Now, before I get it, this is not a question. So far, this is like the person at the conference who stands up and preaches. But let me throw that at you. I mean, what are we actually thinking of when we're thinking of a context that, somebody Jewish who's writing a gospel, or maybe not Jewish, maybe they're Gentile and they're writing a gospel, but they're going to pull on maybe some Jewish kind of stories, or like what is their world like? What do they have to draw on? What kind of education do they have? How do they even go about doing a project like writing a gospel?
Yeah, I think it's a dichotomy that's often drawn, and that would have been my second point. Is that normally when you go to seminaries, divinity schools, even religious studies departments, the status quo has been to see the New Testament as fundamentally an internal Jewish project, like a sect of Judaism almost. But if you go to antiquity, you see Hellenism wasn't just an influence; it wasn't just kind of a trend or something like this, or even a neighboring culture. It was the operating system for classical civilization. And so if you lived in these cities, it was unavoidable. It's kind of like it's pretended nowadays that the early Christians were dropped in from some unimaginably alien kind of context and just dropped into Corinth or Ephesus or Rome or whatever. And they just can't, they're finding all of this, again, deeply offensive and alien to them and disorienting all this. No, they've been swimming in this for centuries, and we see the evidence in vivid detail in so many texts that survive from that time period that Hellenizing, that was just the standard. In fact, it's hard to find any type of Judaism from that period that was untouched by Hellenism. I don't know of it. Even in the caves of Qumran, you're going to find some Hellenistic influences there. And those are folks that are trying as best as they can to be as separatist as possible.
Yeah. What I was thinking as I was reading the first few chapters of your book is, the lines that we draw around things matter when you're going to study, the ancient world. And even in, you've kind of already argued, but the modern line, the lines we draw in the academy between the classics and religious studies or biblical studies or a theology department are, somewhat artificial. And I think it's funny that when I went and hung out with classicists, there was somewhat of an open secret that a lot of Christianity had taken some of this, but they also, for some reason, the classicists didn't really want to touch Christianity. I don't know, maybe a classicist can speak to that, for whatever reason. And I think a lot of people trained in either New Testament or Hebrew Bible will spend a lot of time studying the internal texts of the movement, but not a lot of time reading the sort of contemporary texts that, any educated person, and if you look at, somebody educated enough to write a gospel who's had their education and learned to write in Greek at that level, they've certainly read something that wasn't Bible at some point.
Right. Yeah, that's right. The paideia of that time is kind of what you're touching on in terms of education and all of that. There's only so many people that were the idea that everyone could write. Well, that's not the case back then. So there's a special class of people, and it typically was some measure of education that was distinguishing them in their skill set to be able to do this. And others. Robin Faith Walsh speaks of them as elites and this kind of thing, and I don't think that's too far off. It's kind of like chess players, you've got really great chess players, and then you've got amazing chess players that are at the top echelon that are like light years ahead of even the greats. And I think that there are different levels of writing. There's good and there's great and there's historic. There's the Virgils and Homers and so forth. But there are a whole bunch of other maybe lower down on the tier writers of that period that still required sophisticated education in order to be able to conduct their writing careers. And so it wasn't this idea that it was just a bunch of bums and fishermen sitting around, scribbling on paper. I think it's a bit of a myth that would not have carried too well in the ancient world, but it made the movement seem like it was a grassroots movement in some ways. But I think everybody understood that the copyists, the writers, the authors, there was a lot of sophistication there. And the more we investigate these texts, the more we find that sophistication, intertextuality, awareness, deep awareness. I don't think it would have even survived. The agency of these texts required that sophistication in order for it to eclipse what was there in the Roman world. And so it just wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it lacked in those areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think, well, that's a really good segue into actually looking at some texts. And I think as I read through your book, I don't know how many you list there. It's a lot. Do you have a number? Is it like 30 or 100 or something? Or how many translation, how many stories do you list there?
Yeah, I call it the gallery, and it was really just a sample. I could have gone on further. There's more in the ancient world. I probably could have. I think I counted it in my personal research upwards to 200 or something like this. But those are ones that I hand selected that I felt like gave it was kind of a cornucopia of, a good cross section, really, of a sample of the variety. And that's really kind of what I wanted to do, is show the thematic cluster of kind of signals. How would a reader have picked up when they saw one of these what it meant? So I wanted to give enough of a good enough variety that people could see the elasticity of the trope, and as well as the commonality. What are the common sort of traits that seem to recur um, across? And so, yeah, and so that it's really an analysis trying to cut across them.
So I think one of the things that stood out to me, it's funny, even through my PhD, I was aware of like some of the Alexander romances, that kind of stuff, but I didn't realize how much is here until I read your book. I honestly have never, like I kind of knew that there was stuff floating out there, but I think seeing it really systematized and laid out was really incredible. And within a few days, just quite frankly challenged the way that I've read and thought about the Gospels in a lot of ways, and brought out stuff that I hadn't noticed before. So I think with that in mind, what I'd like to do is dive in. The premise is that Christian resurrection, the way the resurrection is portrayed in the Gospels, isn't unique. There's a lot of baggage with that question, and I think even now I can envision some listeners, struggling with this material, because especially it can be something shocking when frankly you've kind of lived your whole life in a bubble that says there has never been anything like this in history, that the resurrection of Jesus was this unique moment. No other religion has captured it, no other nothing else has had anything similar. For me, it was, growing up as an evangelical, it was like everybody else tried to work their way to God, and we had these like religious tropes that we think about, and then the salvation of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, all these parts are just unique stories. And because they are so unique, it almost shows that they are divinely inspired, because they're so different, they're so so unparalleled. And then we start looking at these stories from the ancient world, and we realize actually these stories were everywhere all the time in different forms, and some of the parallels are uncanny, and some of them are a little looser, a little more vague. It's not necessarily every single one that you're going to say, wow, that's where the gospel writer stole from. But what you get when you read these is you get a sense that we have a world that is swimming with stories of resurrection or translation or different types of divine disappearances and reappearances that we see in the gospels. Is that a fair assessment? That's another comment that should have been in question, but
I think it's perfectly fair, and I think you get basically it's structural language. It's how you would indicate to the reader that this is one of those kinds of stories. And so various signals in there. And you see this pattern across. I think we're going to look at Plutarch here in the next, and he's identifying that pattern, and it shows awareness that the ancients understood this. He's presuming that his readers understand this trope, and he's pointing it out, and he's trying to make a commentary on that from his kind of Platonizing philosophical ideals that he's presenting in his basically it's kind of a biography for Romulus. And so he wants to he applies some criticism, but he's identifying this trope there. And so I don't know if you want to read through this for our viewers.
Yeah, I can let me read it. I chose this one out of one of your many things in the gallery because this was one that came up a lot, and there were quite a few really nice segues into gospel conversation. So we're going to read just so the viewers know. We'll read this. This is from Plutarch's Lives, and it's the life of Romulus, and not the whole thing, just a piece of it. And then we'll jump down and talk about the Gospel of Mark. Then we'll talk about a piece from the Gospel of Luke and anything else that Dr. Miller wants to bring in. So why don't we start by reading this, and this can, I think, kind of tee up our discussion. So let me see here. This is Romulus. So Romulus has insulted the Senate, and because Romulus has insulted the Senate, he's going to disappear. But the real question is what happens after he disappears. When he mysteriously disappeared shortly afterward, suspicion fell upon the Senate. Romulus vanished on the Nuns of July, as it's called now, then Quintilis, leaving no reliable account or widely accepted explanation of his death except for the date I've just mentioned. Even today, many ceremonies are performed that resemble what happened then. Romulus disappeared suddenly with no trace of his body or clothing. Some believe the senators attacked and killed him in the temple of Vulcan, cut his body into pieces, and each carried away a portion hidden in the folds of their robes. Others think his disappearance happened neither in Vulcan's temple nor when only senators were present. They say he was holding a public assembly outside the city near the so-called Goat's Marsh, when suddenly strange and unexplainable disturbances filled the air. The sun's light failed and night descended upon them, not peacefully, but with terrible thunder and fierce winds driving rain from all directions. During this chaos, the crowds scattered and fled, but the nobles gathered closely together. When the storm ended and the sun reappeared, the people gathered again in the same place, anxiously searching for their king. The nobles didn't allow them to investigate his disappearance, but instead urged them to honor and revere Romulus, saying he had been taken up to heaven and would now be a benevolent god for them instead of a good king. At this point, Julius Proculius, a patrician of noble birth and excellent character, who was trusted by and close to Romulus, one of the settlers from Elba, came forward in the marketplace. Touching the most sacred objects under oath, he announced to everyone that while walking on the road, Romulus had appeared to him, approaching from the opposite direction. He appeared more handsome and taller than ever before, dressed in brilliant, gleaming armor. Stunned by this vision, Proculus said, "O king, what happened? What were you thinking to leave us facing unjust accusations while abandoning the entire city to overwhelming grief?" Romulus replied, "The gods decided, Proculus, that I should spend only this much time among humans. Having come from heaven, and after founding a city destined for the greatest power and glory, I must return to heaven. Farewell, and tell the Romans that by practicing self-discipline alongside courage, they will reach the heights of human power. I will be with you as the divine spirit, Quirinus." The Romans found this account believable because of both the speaker's character and his oath. Moreover, a divine-like enthusiasm seemed to touch everyone. No one contradicted him, but instead all set aside suspicion and accusations and began to pray to Quirinus and honor him as a god. Now, this is where Plutarch's going to give us some context here, which I think is also really important. This story resembles Greek legends about Aristeas of Proconnesus and Cleomedes of Astypalia. They say Aristeas died in a fuller's shop, but when his friends came for his body, it had vanished. Others immediately reported seeing Aristeas walking toward Croton. As for Cleomedes, who was extraordinarily strong and large, but unstable and prone to violence, he eventually struck and broke a column supporting a school's roof, causing it to collapse and kill the children inside. Pursued afterward, Cleomedes took refuge in a large chest, closing the lid and holding it shut from the inside, so that many men together couldn't pull it open. When they broke open the chest, they found neither a living man nor a corpse. Astonished, they sent messengers to Delphi, where the Pythia had told them Cleomedes of Astypila is the last of the heroes. It is also said that when Alchemy's body was being carried for burial, it vanished, and a stone was found on the funeral bed instead. Many similar stories exist where people elevate mortal nature to divine status. To completely deny virtue's divine quality would be impious and ignoble, but mixing earth with heaven is foolish. Instead, we should follow Pindar's safe middle path. The body of all follows all-powerful death, but a living image of life remains, for this alone comes from the gods. The soul comes from the divine realm and returns there, not with the body, but only when it has been freed and separated from the body, becoming completely pure, fleshless, and holy. As Heraclitus says, the dry soul is the best, flying from the body like lightning from a cloud. But a soul mixed with and full of bodily elements, like a heavy fog or mist, is difficult to ignite or lift upward. There's no need to send the bodies of good people against nature to heaven. Rather, we should believe that according to nature and divine justice, their virtues and souls progress from humans to heroes, from heroes to spirits, and from spirits, if they are completely purified, as in a sacred ritual, escaping all that is mortal and passionate, they rise to join the gods, not by city decree, but by truth and reason, reaching the most beautiful and blessed end. So I didn't realize how long that was going to be before I started reading it out loud, but I love it. It's fantastic. You want to kind of tell us what jumps out at you and what you were thinking as you read this and started to queue up some of the questions?
Yeah, this is great. So, just so we're dealing with a text that's written in the early second century here, earliest parts of the second, maybe 110, something like this. And so, some people will say, okay, well, that's the mark had already been written. Well, if you go back, you could read earlier Roman historians who record the same stories and even include other details in it. And this is going in history works. It's, you could read Livy's history of Rome, and he's got this legend in there as well. And so this is inside of history works. And so, a lot of, you'll find religionists, Christian confessionalists that are upset with the parallels I've made because of that. But just they don't have a historian that wrote any of their legends regarding Jesus. You've got cultic literature only, and here we've got actual, civic writers recording these legends, and so I think that gives it a certain amount of. And now we don't believe these stories either, but and I don't even think Plutarch does here, but he records it for posterity as part of kind of the framing of the story of Romulus, the founder of the empire, possibly is the most famous iconified political figure in all of Roman antiquity. And so there are temples in various cities, and they say that at some point here it talks about the kind of the veneration and the reenactment of this scene that goes on around the empire. It's actually on the calendar. So he disappears. There's an alternate account, just kind of like what you get with Jesus, you get in the New Testament, this idea that the disciples stole the body, kind of this, and it's a disgraceful kind of end. But the other story is that he's exalted to heaven, right? So, and that's really what we get with the Gospels as well. So I'm going to start trying to tie some of this to that. So they assassinated, he's betrayed and killed, kind of like Julius Caesar in that way. And in similar way, Jesus' closest, companions, at least you've got, the idea that he's betrayed there. And so the kind of the Judas with the kiss thing. And that's very similar to what Brutus with Julius Caesar and this kind of thing. Going back then to the text, you've got this idea that he ascends to heaven, and there's prodigies. There's thunderclap, darkness over the land, whatever you get in the earthquake and this kind of thing in the New Testament. These are considered prodigies, and that is signs that something significant in history is happening that has divine attention in some way. And so this was a kind of a Roman motif that you see in a variety of instances throughout Roman literature and even Hellenistic literature as well. And so the sun failed, et cetera, et cetera. Night descended upon them, darkness over the land, and this kind of thing.
So this is almost identical to what we get in the Gospel of Matthew in terms of what happened with the earth. Well, I guess he says, I think Matthew says earthquake, but there's all these kind of celestial kind of occurrences and weather stuff happening.
Yeah. Now these are associations. It's not following an exact like carbon copy pattern, and it shouldn't. None of the translation fables did that, But what they did was they threw out like themes and images that invoked, that signaled for the reader, hey, read this in this way, process this kind of story in this way. And so structural language. And so you've got the prodigies here. With Jesus, they happen near this crucifixion, right? And so, and if you proceed, then you end up with he ascends to heaven, right? And he's deified. He's a son of a god, right? And so, at that point, it's kind of like, well, just those particular. If that's all we knew is that, like, say, 100 individuals ascended to heaven in antiquity, and Jesus was one of them, I think the argument's already over. It just ended there. We almost don't even need to investigate further from an anthropological standpoint. We're dealing with a kind of story, right? But really, what we're doing is digging into some of the further richer details of this and in kind of the soils of ancient literature. And so you've got then a road encounter, a post, he comes back down and has an encounter. And I might quibble over some of the translation that's here.
I should have told the audience what I did and kind of confessed my sins, because I took a really good translation from Perseus, and I'll link to these texts below because you can get them all in English and in Greek online. But I asked AI to make it a little bit more readable, because if you've ever read some of the old translations, they can be a stumble. So this is on me. Any translation.
No, no, no. It's not a bad translation. I wouldn't call it that. It's a fine translation for what we're doing. But there are a couple little nuances where I would tweak. We don't need to get into those in the
No,
detail
that's fine. But
here.
if there is anything you want to point out in the Greek,
Well, it describes it almost as a vision, whereas I would
this word
say,
ophtein I had mentioned because this is what we get in 1 Corinthians 15 with Paul, right? With the like appearance, like it's a very similar kind of language.
yeah, 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 and it's flipped around in English. We say it's an appearance. It almost makes it sound like it's was seen is kind of
Yeah,
its
it's passive.
past
Yeah,
tense kind of
yeah.
idea, and so it really is better or more accurately, if you wanted to get down to the precision, that was seen. And the same thing, it almost gives rise to the idea that this is kind of an ecstatic visionary experience where no, this is somebody that's going to go and swear. We find out later he goes and swears to the Roman government that what he had seen. He gives a confession, a sworn confession of what he had seen, and that it wasn't just him having eaten some bad bread or something like this, and having a weird dream or something, or a kind of a hallucination. That he's claiming that he had a physical, or at least an encounter with this deity on the road, this deified individual, and that it wasn't just sort of a subjective kind of instance. And he gives him a commission to go ye therefore into all the world. If you read Livy's, it basically almost follows the exact language that you get in the Great Commission in Matthew. Go ye therefore into all the world. And of course, the instructions are a little different. It's not, spreading a religion or a particular kind of cultic message from God per se, but it is, propagandistic regarding the might of the Romans and their destiny to be great.
Well, and then so we have this appearance on the road, and this is sort of a happy ending, I guess, as it were. And what it makes me think of, and I think it cues us up to talk about the Gospel of Mark, where you don't have any appearances after Jesus. But this is we'll look at Luke after, and Luke, you get stuff like this too. So before we go there, I think one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book and your article as well, is that when we look at the Gospel of Mark, and it ends kind of abruptly. Maybe I should just go there. We can all scroll back up here after.
May I make another first quick comment, Chris,
Yeah,
regarding
please,
that?
please.
Because it did go off into the very ending there, which was really great that you included it. Discuss kind of philosophically why, and it says there that this is myth making. He calls it mythologeo at some point. That also didn't get translated into the English there. That many have created such myths. Many have mythologized in this fashion. It's in the where is it at? You'll see. Oh, there it is. You just you're near it. No, down one. There it is. Yeah, mythologusi. Yeah, and many mythologize such things. Tauta, and so Polatauta, mythologusi, basically many mythologize him, and that's kind of, and I don't know that that gets translated into English over on the other side too well, but um,
It's just kind of, yeah, many
yeah,
similar stories
basically.
exist, but it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't do it justice. It should use that word. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he's classing it that, he's not saying this is like, he's recognizing this is that kind of story. This is myth making. And further that those that improperly, I think, would be the many. It says many similar stories existed, and it says that that they improperly assign divinity to the mortal state features of human beings or something like this in another translation I've read, and so basically he's going to go on and criticize this idea that it's a human body that survived. That basically what he wants to do there is Platonize, which is his larger project, and part of what his whole kind of idea of writing is to Platonize some of these stories and criticize them from a Platonic standpoint. And so he wants to strip away the idea that Romulus had a physicality, that his physical body ascended. He's having problems with that, and that's why he's criticizing these stories in some ways. Is because in his world, you want to shed the body. The body is an encumbrance. It's a problem in Stoic philosophy and Platonic philosophy, and so he's wanting to critically engage these stories on that level. But he's unique in some ways in that the Roman emperors, when they ascended to heaven, also were said to leave their bodies behind. But for the most part, the translation fable, they would exchange a mortal body for a divine body, which was physical. It could fight in wars. It can eat fish. It can write, literary works. Even one individual does that. Or they talk about Aristeas. He actually came back, had an appearance story, and came back and wrote a literary work, and then vanished again. There was definitely a remaining physicality that went on there. Anyway, we can move on.
That's it's a great cue up, because I think the one thing I wanted to hone in on for comparing to Mark, before we even get to the appearances after, is just the significance of the disappearance of the body. Because even that, not only in this text, you had included quite a few other texts in your book that talk about this. But I think for me, it really gave a lot of flavor to Mark, because when we look at Mark, I mean, a lot of viewers will know. If you don't, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the ending of Mark that was printed in, like the King James Bible, for example, I think I'm right in that because I read it a lot as a kid. The ending of the Gospel of Mark originally just ended with this thing. Where am I here? Where it says, this is the women. They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then at some point, maybe in the 2nd century, I think you say this in your book too, another ending. Obviously, this was considered quite unsatisfactory to readers. And there's a more expanded ending about, like, I think it kind of echoes some of the Great Commission, and it just rehashes Jesus, like the highlight reel, to close out the gospel in a much more satisfactory way to the reader. But I think that one of the things that really struck me as I was reading your book is that how satisfying this in itself could have been to some of the earliest readers of Mark. Like, we certainly do have later stories develop, and we'll read one in a minute in the other gospels, that also look like, these stories, like from Plutarch. But I think this in itself is saying quite a lot when I read this. And it's not actually an incomplete story, that the disappearance of the body in itself is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I think out of the gallery that I gave, disappearing body, that was probably the quintessential signal. Now, it's not the way that a translation fable is always. There's a cluster of signals, but over half of them, that's what indicated in the narrative that you had a translation, and that was often not even further unpacked, that so and so disappeared on this day in battle or whatever, and we now worship him as a god, this kind of thing. And it's some of them will just say, and so disappeared, and the implication therefore is that they set up cultists and this kind of thing. And so it was such a well entrenched. This is over 1,000 years of writing that goes way beyond even the New Testament into late antiquity, and all the way back to early, almost the Greek Dark Ages, Pindar and Herodotus and these guys. And so all the way through. And so you end up with this motif that's recurring over and over. It was well established and unmistakable to ancient readers. And so this ending then, albeit abrupt, would have been a fantastic ending. It would have spurred all sorts of imagination about, okay, well, what happens after that? And awkward, abrupt endings were pretty common in the ancient world. Virgil's Aeneid ends awkwardly. Heck, the Book of Acts ends awkwardly. You don't know what happened. All it just kind of trails off. That almost seems inexcusable by modern standards in some way. But back then, that would have been considered great writing, and but still unsatisfying in the sense that others came along and wanted to build, accretion, build more epilogical content. Good place for that because it's the end of the scroll, right? So you can kind of add some more stuff there. So that's what you see with the other gospel writers that are building off of Mark as a kind of a platinum hit that had been the first.
I like that. So we could imagine that, if somebody's just reading Mark in the years between 70 and whenever, another gospel's written, that they wouldn't have got to the end and said like, oh crap, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me also point out that they flee there in fear. That's also Romulus. You just read the story. That's what they did. They fled in fear. And that's what gets reenacted in the calendric, the Populi Fugia they had on the calendar in the Roman cities. They would all reenact this, kind of like we reenact, Easter egg hunts or whatever. And in our culture, they would reenact that event, and everyone would flee as part of the event to celebrate and commemorate this particular major calendric, cultural, political calendar event. And so it was, and so I actually argue in the face of all of the other, data, that all the other illusions that are unmistakable once they start compounding, that this is invoking that in some way.
And then I think like one of the things that, YouTube is obsessed with this question of, does John's gospel present Jesus as God? Does Mark's gospel present Jesus as God? I don't know if you've seen any of these, but they're quite popular, including with a couple big debates and in just the last couple of weeks. But I think one of the things that as I was reading this, I kind of put the book down and I thought, I think I see Mark differently, understanding what you're arguing, because I think, now you tell me, maybe I'm way off, but I think I would have, if you asked me if Mark was, sees Jesus as God last week, I probably would have said, I don't think so. I think he's a very elevated human being. But I think what we actually get in this moment, tell me if I'm reading your evidence wrong, but this is actually almost the moment where Jesus either becomes God or proves he's God. Maybe not God like the like either Yahweh or the unmoved mover of Platonic philosophy, but divinity, right? This is the point where we've kind of proved divinity. Is that a fair assessment, or am I way off?
I love that. I love that. Yeah, and I think there are other things that go on. Like the gospel itself kicks off with the beginning, arche, the beginning of Jesus, of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a son of a God. We us they. And there's no articles there. A son of a God. In other words, the ideological story, the beginning story of Jesus Christ, a demigod. I'm getting ready to give you a demigod story. Are you ready? Here we go. And that's on the title page. And then you go into that and you see him perform, distinguish himself from normal human beings and having authority over demons and wind and fish and whatever. His divinity is shown in various ways. But I think in the ancient world, what you get is it's more of a hierarchical world. You've got, animals, slaves, blah, 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 all the way up, aristocrats or whatever. And the only way you can get above that really is to claim divinity. And so you've got lesser gods, kind of lowercase g or lowercase d divinities or whatever, that are the kings and heroes. And in that situation, you've got an Olympic boxer. You've got Alcmene, we've got, and so there's a part of an aristocratic family, a royal family. You've got Aristeas, who is a wonder worker and poet and miracle guy who's also a son of a god in ancient texts. And you've got Romulus, who's also being deified, so to speak. And I think the thing that's hard for modern readers to catch is that this was honorific. This was their Hall of Fame. This is the way in literature you put someone up in lights, is through stylizing their narrative through these protocols. and saying this is an iconic figure. This goes in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or whatever classical antiquity. These are the most signified individuals. And the way that they did that is by through divine birth and through deification, which was often signaled by ascension and translation fables at the end of their story.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay. I'm going to let's keep going here because I just have so many other questions, but we're just going to have to do more videos in the future because we can't, we just absolutely can't have a 4-hour video. Maybe people would watch it and that would be very nice, but we'll try to keep it a little tighter. Yeah. Let's come to the road to Emmaus. We've already kind of, I think, whetted the appetite for a story of somebody meeting them on the road. Now, even the one from Plutarch wasn't the only one you mentioned. There was a couple other stories, I believe, about somebody meeting a translated person on a road after they had disappeared. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. So, there's a second one even in Plutarch there, where he gives with Aristeas, where he falls dead in the fuller's shop, and then they meet him on the road to Cyzicus. It says Croton there, I think, in Plutarch's edition, but there's a variety of individuals that record that one. And then, so there's road encounters there. This is a trope. And with the Caesars, you end up with a variety of road encounters. And I document this in the book. There's a whole number of them that meet individuals on the Via Appia. And then those individuals go forward as part of the funerary consecration for the Caesars and swear in front of the entire crowd that they had seen Caesar after he'd already died on the road and had a conversation with them and this kind of thing. And so this happened repeatedly. Livius Geminus is one of them, and there's a few of them. Numerius Atticus. These are individuals that stepped forward. There were famous individuals that stepped forward and swore on oath that they had seen the post-mortem emperor had an encounter with them in their deified state.
Wow. Okay. I should read this. Let's read this section. I didn't read the Mark part, but in honor of Easter, because in some churches they just read all this end to end right on Easter. So it's a little bit, but why don't I read it as part of our own Easter celebrations, and then maybe we'll talk about it, because I don't like just putting a text up on screen and not giving people an opportunity to digest it a bit. And this is from the NRSV. This is no fancy AI translations here. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And then he goes, I won't read all this part, but then he goes to stay with them. He breaks bread, and then their eyes are open and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" And then they go and tell the others in Jerusalem. So I'm going to read a little bit more about this after, because I want to handle the ghost question, which is also interesting. But as you read about that encounter, like what kind of jumps out at you as you hear that?
Oh, a whole number of things that we just talked about. The road encounters, that's already a trope. Already ancient readers would have picked up on that instantly. It would not have been lost on them. The idea that he's incognito, this is also a power of the gods to be able to appear to people, have theophanies, epiphanies, this kind of thing. This is a trope in the ancient world, the idea that a deity would come and you would have an encounter with them, this kind of thing, and that they wouldn't be recognizable, or that they could choose to be recognizable to whomever they wish. And so you even get this in the Damascus Road, but you get this also in a whole host of other ancient texts where gods come and they can select who gets to recognize who they are and
Yeah.
when. And this
Is
kind of
this a standard? Sorry, just to interject. Is this a standard way? Like I'm reading the Greek here, so we literally have like their eyes, ekranunto. So like they were literally like stopped, I guess, like prevented. Is that right? From recognizing him or not to recognize him, essentially. Is that a standard way to talk about this? Like there's obviously an agency here that is.
Creteo, yeah, the idea that they were controlled in that way, that Creteo is kind of to handle. And so this is the idea there is that they are, that this is the work of the God. The God is deciding this, that they're able to see or not see who it is. And so you get this even in Homer with Athena. If you go back and read the epics, the Odyssey or whatever, Homer's there having, interactions with Athena, and she's able to then be recognizable or not recognizable. She even gives that to him where he's able to be recognizable, not recognizable. And it actually makes him look like a doddering beggar as he comes back to his own people as king. They don't recognize him until that kind of is lifted from him. And so that's a divine kind of prerogative that's in these different narratives.
Okay, cool. And then I jumped in there, but so they're what are the other tropes? So first of all, they're not able to recognize him. There was other things here?
Yeah, well, there's this idea that, and this is, I draw into question, you have a hard time going back into the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint or whatever and finding the resurrection there as predicting this as a particular narrative event or event in history or anything like that. And so it takes a very, very, very creative midrashic kind of reading of those texts in order to somehow achieve the narrative that's here. And so I do not think that that's the underpinning. And so a lot of people got lost in scholarship trying to comb through the scripture to find some little trace of something that would indicate how this narrative was even conceived. And it's just not there to be had. You can find little bits of this and that there, but it's almost kind of Kabbalistic kind of reading the text and not really true to anything that's in the ancient text. And so then this is almost like a way to kind of give it credence, since Luke is a later gospel text that's trying to give kind of ancient precedent to the story in some way and dress it up in Jewish garb.
Well, it struck me as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Matthew and Matthew taking Mark and using it, and but injecting a lot of Septuagint and saying like so that it might be fulfilled. Like it almost sounds like that's what Matthew is doing. I didn't queue up a Matthean text here, but it almost seems like Matthew is taking this very Greco-Roman tropic literature and making it more Jewish. Like, is that a fair assessment?
It is, yeah. It's almost like putting decorations. The form is there coming straight out of Judah or out of Hellenism and Romanism, but then they put these decorations that kind of festoon it with the kind of Judaic decals or kind of ornaments and this kind of thing, and just to kind of give it a little flavor. It's almost like spice in a stew or something. They're adding a little spice in there, and so yeah. But if you go back and critically interrogate those excerpts and things that they're quoting from, you kind of realize, okay, this is a very loose, maybe not even the most honest reading of this particular text at the time. And so, but I don't think they were terribly caring about that. It's midrashic. And I think the audience wasn't going to go back and check all of those references too closely either. And
It's
so,
fascinating though, because I think, and we definitely should not go down this rabbit hole today. But I think often we think about like the early stages of this Jesus movement in the Gospels as being a very Jewish type of movement, and then it gradually takes on more Greco-Roman characteristics. And this is almost like you could almost make the case that it's the reverse. And I think that's not only shocking to a reader, that's actually kind of flies in the face of the way biblical scholarship has thought about a lot of this stuff for a long time.
that's right. That's right. And that really distinguishes some of my work and some of the people that I'm in circle with, in communication with, is that, there's Hellenistic Judaism. This is almost like Judaistic Hellenism, kind of the reverse. It's like it starts with Hellenism and puts Judaistic kind of decor or attire over it in this way, and so it's almost like that's the afterthought to what's going on. Now there are some highly Jewish elements in there, like apocalypticism, but even that's a borrowing from Persia, and I think registers to the larger kind of myths of the East in so many ways, given the relative size of Parthia and Persia and this kind of thing relative to the smaller region of Judaism and the larger history of the East and West in their conflicts and relationships over the millennia or the centuries there. And so
Yeah, that
it's
makes sense. And I mean, it just speaks to the complexity of identity that really we can't point to any of these texts and say like, oh, that's Jewish, that's Hellenistic, just pull out the Jewish and pull out the Hellenistic and you've got two different things. Like these are, worn together very tightly and wound. And I don't know that anybody thinking, coming back to the question of like who our reader or our imagined author would be of these things to say like, which part of you is Jewish and which part is,
uh-huh.
Greek.
Just think about music, Chris. I mean, I don't want to take much time here, but the biggest hits in music are usually fusions between different prior things. It takes in old and new. It takes in different genres, often crosses them into one thing. So it's this kind of singularity that's going on, this fusion that makes this such an exciting and kind of dangerous movement.
That's so interesting. Okay, let's keep moving. But I'm kind of getting little threads here for maybe things we can do in future videos. Let's come down to the this final thing, and then I think we can kind of wrap up for today. But one of the where am I here? Not the breaking of the bread. I wanted to talk about because this is something that just shocked me in your book: the possibility of Jesus as a ghost and what actually is happening in this story. The difference between being sort of a specter. That's not the right word though. What's the word I'm thinking of? The sort of half, like not divinized, but what's the word? Do I have it in my notes? A revenant. Sorry, that's the word I'm looking for. A revenant. So that really stood out to me. That the question of whether Jesus is a revenant or deified. So in your book, you kind of suggest that we need to look for clues that Jesus is almost like the right kind of apparition. So maybe let me just read this and I'll throw that. Is that okay if I do that? I'll read this and then throw it over to you to
Yeah,
comment on.
yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So while they were talking about this, this is the disciples I think they're in a locked room, right? While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, Peace be with you. They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, Why are you frightened and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet and see that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, Have you anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence. That's it. So what's the significance of a Jesus that isn't just a floating apparition, but can be touched and he can eat fish?
I think these texts are working overtime to exclude the other possibilities. That he was. So what are the possibilities? These ghosts, right? Or that he's resuscitated. That's another one that, I mean, this isn't like Lazarus or Jairus's daughter or whatever, only to die again, right? And we have a lot of stories of that in the ancient world. No, this is somebody that's being exalted. And so he can walk through walls, exit a tomb that's sealed, or walk into a closed chamber in John that's already, they've locked the chamber, and all of a sudden he appears there in front of them. And then he says, touch me, feel me. In this situation, I'm not a ghost. He's trying to the writer's trying to afford all clarity on this, because those would have been the categories in the ancient world. Is he a ghost? Is he resuscitated? Or is he exalted to divinity, translated? And so they're trying to exclude the other possibilities and say, no, he's exalted to divinity. This is my beloved son. Listen to him, like it says on the Transfiguration there. He's not to be regarded as anything but a son of a god in this literary act here. Yeah, they have been eating broiled fish. Now, a lot of scholars have misinterpreted this, I think, as trying to indicate, well, see, he's got his body back or whatever. Well, no, like I said, he's able to walk through walls. He's able to disfigure himself. He's able to ascend, descend, do all sorts of things. Those are the powers of the gods. And so his body is not like yours and mine in this text, or any other individuals other than those that have been translated. It's kind of like you're exchanging your mortal body for an immortal body that has superpowers, so to speak. The gospel apological kind of accounts are trying to afford all clarity with all kinds of redundancy that Jesus has one of these bodies.
Like, I want to make sure I read this right and understood this right, but it's almost like if Jesus is a spirit of some sort, that a revenant, and I'm learning about this from your book, so tell me if maybe I didn't understand it, but it almost seems like there's a certain category of like a ghost that would be almost crossed over to the underworld, but not completely. and that's like a bad ghost. And if that ghost shows up, you can't touch them or handle them. But if somebody has gone through apotheosis and they're deified, then they can do things on the world.
Yeah, yeah. He would have been given an immortal body. In other words, he gets to go up to heaven. The ghosts that come up from Hades or whatever in narratives, the kind of the ghost tradition. I've got a couple books on that. They're really fun to read, actually. Ghost stories from antiquity. These are individual. There's a lot of stories where they go and try and grab. Oh, I see Mother. I'm going to go and give her a hug, and then she disappears like a wisp of
Yeah,
air. And so there's this frustration you see in the ancient literature of not really being able to have human like qualities or be able to interact in that way. Whereas the gods, once you're translated to divinity, not only do you have human like qualities, but you transcend the limitations and the bad parts of having a flesh and blood body. You know, you're going to live forever. You know, you don't have a corruptible body, and you've got a superhuman body that's able to ascend and go like multi-locate, walk through walls, even change your appearance and decide who gets to see you. And so it's kind of like superpowers in that way.
that's cool. That's really neat. Okay. Anything else you want to point out in any of these texts as we're kind of wrapping up?
No, no. I think that just only that. I think what we're dealing with is no. It's not a unique story, but it's a way of elevating someone that was unlikely. Right? This was a prosecuted person under Roman law. That's really what makes this unique in that way. Is you've got somebody that had gone through a Roman execution, a trial, was executed for violent crimes in Jerusalem or whatever, and the gospels are doing considerable work to sanitize that and to make him, to exalt him and give him a dignified kind of end there. And so they're reversing the ignobility of that in so many ways and saying, no, not only was he not a criminal in the way that he was cast, but he's exalted to your highest guy, even Romulus, divine Romulus. And so they are hailing him as a god.
That really stuck out at me while I was reading as well, because I think the amount of these stories that were reserved for emperors or for exceptional people, and powerful people, and I think there's somebody who could read these comparisons and say like, oh, you can't compare Jesus to Julius Caesar, or because that's a different, those are different categories of people, or Alexander the Great. This is not, the gospel writers wouldn't think of comparing Jesus to to these kind of military or political leaders, but it's striking exactly what that comparison is doing. As you've just said, like there's a really tremendous something happening. And I think when I think of that, the famous words on the cross, this is Rex Judea, the gospels become a powerful statement about who Jesus was and what position he held and should hold.
Yeah, yeah. He's a transcendent king. He's a philosopher in some ways. He's a wonder worker. You see these kind of motifs also come together in the stories of Pythagoras, the kind of the school of Pythagoras and the legends around him, but also Apollonius of Tyana. There's a whole cult around him as well, and he ascends to heaven. He raises people from the dead. He has, casts out demons and does a lot of similar things in his story. He lived in the first century as well, and so got a number of kind of legends around him, and has post-mortem appearance and has an ascension at the end of his erotology, his narrative there, exalting him. And not a political figure per se, but more of a philosophical kind of opponent to politics. He stands trial in front of Nero and does. So there's a lot of similarities there.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I think we should wrap it up there, because I think what I kind of said as we were planning this is the book one more time, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. I'll leave a link down below as well. I think I was struck by how much is in this book, and how much I wanted to keep our discussion a little bit bounded today, just because I think we could talk a lot, and I hope we will in the future, about some of this stuff. But it's tremendous, and I think already for me reading some of this stuff, and I had heard you interview before, but I hadn't read the book before this week. It opens up a lot of interesting questions about how we look at early Christianity and its culture, how we look at the production of literature, which I know you mentioned, both your work and I think Robin Walsh's work as well, even Dennis MacDonald. So there's a lot of really, really rich things in this book, and I hope we can continue discussing in the future. But for now, I want to say thank you very much for being here and for talking to me about these things today. I appreciate it.
It was a great conversation, Chris. I love talking to you. You have a lot of your background and just your knowledge of everything. It affords a rich conversation where we're able to climb into these topics in ways that are really fascinating, and I enjoy talking with you and getting to know you.
Absolutely. Well, we'll pick this up more in the future for sure. Is there somewhere that people can find you?
I don't have my own YouTube. If you want to watch some of my stuff, you could see it on Myth Vision with Derek Lambert. Hopefully, I'll be back on your podcast as well. I know Gnostic Informant has me on there, and you could search me up on History Valley. I did a show or two on there. If you want to connect with me, I'm on Facebook, and so if you look up Dr. Richard C. Miller on there, you'll find an author page there, and I do answer messages and so forth. And so if you want to reach out there, also I have an academia page, and so I think my email is listed there as well. And so you can reach me through any number of ways, and I love to interact with people. So don't
Awesome.
hesitate to do that.
I'll put some of those links to some of the interviews I've watched in the description as well, because that's a great place to go if people want to hear more from you. And unfortunately, all we could do today was whet the appetite. There is so much more, but we'll cover it next time. So one last time, thanks again for being here, and thank you to the audience as well for taking the time to watch. I hope this has been helpful to you. Absolutely, leave a comment below if you have a question or a follow up, and maybe Dr. Miller can I can shoot him questions if there are some, but we can also maybe pick this up in a later date if there's more things that we should be talking about. So please take a minute, leave a comment down below if you have a question, or even just to say that you appreciated this if you did. Hopefully you did. So yeah, I think that's it for today. But thank you again, and I'll see you next time.